Hello and welcome back to episode 4 of In Conversation With, and I'm joined tonight once again by the ever-charming Exerbia. Welcome back to the show.
Hello, how's it going?
Not too bad, how are you?
Yeah, super, thank you. Yeah, all good.
That's good. I suppose lots has changed in the world since we'd last had our conversation together.
just a touch. Including messing up the first version of this podcast, I guess. Yeah, there's always there's that first catastrophe on the pile.
Yeah,
of the
indeed. just so everyone's aware who's listening at the minute, we did have another version of this podcast that we've recorded, and it went brilliantly, and then one of us wasn't recording it. So
yeah, mystiverse. Yeah, what's wrong with you, man?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I apologise.
You have one job. I fucked up big time. I'm very sorry about that. That was a big screw up on my part.
Well, hopefully we learn from our mistakes. That's what mistakes are for anyway.
Yeah, the royal we. Yeah, absolutely.
The royal we.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hopefully I do, yeah.
Well, anyway, before we get into the discussion for today, I just wanted to say a massive thank you to those who listened to the previous podcast we did on all the different platforms, whether you watched on YouTube or Spotify. I never in a million years imagined there would be such positive feedback, and there was some fantastic discussions we saw going on in the comments. Also, a big thank you, for picking up and correcting all our many errors that we definitely made.
Indeed.
In that podcast. We'd be nothing without you. But yeah, so tonight we'll be discussing transhumanism. But before we get into that, I think we should just have a brief mention about some of the slightly more contentious things we were talking about in the previous episode. So one of the massive things I'm sure you noticed from the discussion was this debate that was going on over first and third person dreaming.
Yeah, that was my second screw up. Okay, yeah, indeed, yes, yeah, quite. I thought people were very civil about this, but they were almost unanimously in agreement that it was possible to dream in the third person, I think.
Yeah, well, this is something I found quite weird because I found myself agreeing with you in that I'd only ever, or at least from what I could recollect, I'd only had dreams in the first person. I found it massively weird that so many other people had experiences with third person dreaming.
Yeah, okay, well, you still staunchly on my side with this one. So you haven't had this kind of out of body dreaming experience. I only say it out of jealousy. I wish I had at some point, to be honest.
No, yeah, me too. I mean, I can only talk about my personal experience, but from all the experiences I've had, I can never recollect dreaming in a sort of out of body God's eye view.
Yeah, well, but we seem to be the minority here, in fairness. Interestingly, yeah.
Yeah, that is true, yeah. Well, maybe we're just weird then.
Yeah, yeah, right. That sounds like
that's the obvious conclusion to draw from that.
I'll go with that one, yeah. That sounds good.
And the second major thing I wanted to just touch on a little bit before we dive into our discussion for tonight was there was a slight bit of confusion around the Max Tegmark's free will argument. And so I've got the book, I've highlighted the section, I've just paraphrased it slightly. So I'll just read out this little excerpt and hopefully it clears things up for those who were a bit confused. He says this: free will discussions usually center around a struggle to reconcile our goal-oriented decision-making behavior with the laws of physics. If you're choosing between I asked her out on a date because I really liked her, or my particles made me do it, moving in accordance to the law of physics, then which one's correct? Well, Max Tegmark wants to say that both are correct. What feels like goal-oriented behavior can emerge from goalless deterministic laws of physics. Just like it's impossible to determine what a computer program will do until you run it, it's typically impossible for you to figure out what you'll decide to do in a second in less than a second, which reinforces your experience of having free will. Both biological and artificial consciousnesses feel that they have free will. They feel that it's really them who decide, and they can't predict with certainty what the decision will be until they finish thinking it through. Their subjective experience of free will is simply how their computations feel from the inside. They don't know the outcome of a computation until they finished it. That's what it means to say the computation is the decision. And hopefully that clears things up. I probably didn't explain it the best. It's best if you go and read the book Life 3.0. It's a fantastic book.
Oh, but, I thought your explanation was bang on when we talked about it. Well, it was an idea I hadn't come across, and it certainly embedded itself in me. But I think that line there captures it so well. Their subjective experience of free will is simply how their computations feel from the inside. That's such a good line. In terms of it's kind of compatibilism, right? Like the kind of perfect merger of free will and determinism, no?
Yeah, that's touching on it, and that excerpt was taken from kind of a few paragraphs worth of argument, and it was a bit complicated. So hopefully that untangles it a little bit.
Yeah, indeed. Was there? I didn't. Was there a lot of contention about that one?
There wasn't so much contention. There was a bit more confusion as to what Max Tegmark was on about.
Oh,
really.
fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah, indeed. Well, it is pretty far out for sure.
Oh yeah, definitely. So those little admin housekeeping bits out of the way, I think we should move on to tonight's discussion, which is transhumanism. And
Yes.
I don't really know how to introduce it, really. It's such a massive concept with
Yeah.
so many different attributes and everything. So I guess I'll just give that one to you then. How would you define transhumanism?
Thanks a bunch. Thank you so much for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
I guess in a soundbite, it would be nice to be a robot, I suppose, or let's become robots. But
Yeah, I suppose that's pretty good.
I don't know enough about it to do even like a pseudo academic introduction to it, but I would say it probably started with the religious myths of humans transcending to the godly realms, whether it be with the ancient Greeks. To be honest, you could probably make an argument that Jesus was a transhumanist, I suppose, if you want to go a bit crazy with that one. But then I suppose he originated from heaven in the first place, so that probably doesn't count. But in essence, yes, the long tradition now of humans thinking about using technology to alter the human condition, to become cyborgs, to become uploaded artificial entities, essentially the theoretical side of most good science fiction, I'd say. How about you? So I can vengefully throw that question back at you. What comes to your mind when you hear transhumanism?
Well, I would say firstly that your definition was very good. It was very comprehensive. I don't think I could do it justice better than that. But yeah, it's just this basic idea that's been going back, since the beginnings of science, since the beginnings of medicine, humans wanting to kind of transcend themselves above the biological, above the physical, really, and become something greater, like extend their sense of what they can become.
Absolutely.
And I suppose that begs the question, how long humans have been modifying themselves with technology. So I don't know, where would you say it sort of starts?
Oh, fire is always the kind of stereotypical answer to the first technology, isn't it? I don't know if we know that fire was. I'd imagine it would be. Maybe there's some tool building that came before. Who knows? But in any case, maybe for a stock answer, you could say fire. Even that just was the Promethean game changer, wasn't it? For that just seemed to have set us apart from the animals fairly early on. That we could artificially create it. And that must have really changed the game.
I would say that was a definite starting point. I think one of the other sort of major landmarks you could say was the development of language. I don't know if that strictly counts as improving humanity, but it was something that then enabled us to go on to achieve these feats.
And maybe, in the last podcast, I think we were talking about what the sort of evolutionary incentive was to divide humans from the animal kingdom so much in terms of intelligence. And you have to kind of wonder that maybe language forced that a lot. Maybe we developed like an early linguistic kind of linguistic ability, developed like an early language sense, and it gave us some advantage, and we just kept improving it more and more and more. So it may have had may have been kind of a feedback loop where the brain expanded to keep up with this, so that we could handle even more gossip and blah blah blah. So I guess in that respect, it would be a technology, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose so. That really lends into a definition of kind of the origins of language that I really like from Yuval Noah Harari. And he says that basically language allowed us to gossip and talk about things that weren't strictly physical and in front of us. And it gave us access to all these concepts and ideas that they literally weren't available to us before that.
Yeah. I think we talked about this last time as well. And I think my rebuttal was that I reckon we were probably using language to get laid. I think that was but it's in either way you want to go with this. Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely one of the defining features. Yeah, for sure. That separates us from the animal kingdom. Well, yeah. Hey, that'd be a way cooler answer than fire for the earliest technology.
I find it quite interesting though that you see in all these ancient stories and mythology, particularly perhaps emphasized in the Greek myth of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans. So he improved the human condition. That was, if you want to call fire the cornerstone. And yet in Greek mythology, he was severely punished forever, in fact.
Yeah.
And I just find that quite interesting as how this massive, cornerstone for humanity was the taming of fire. And yet in all this mythology and all these ancient stories, it was punished.
Well, maybe I get a bit annoyed when people start trying to. I don't mean you're doing this. It just reminds me. I get slightly annoyed sometimes when people try to read wisdom into some ancient stories, which is exactly what I'm about to do. That's why I say that as a caveat. But maybe there was some inbuilt moral in there that they already recognized that technology could be a double-edged sword. Maybe they were trying to pass down this something in the mythos. I mean, they must have seen the inherent power of fire being able to burn cities to the ground. That must have been pretty fucking terrifying. I mean, maybe there was some moral in there about the double-edged nature of technology. Like whenever there's kind of a cautionary tale about science, I usually bring up, and everyone else seems to usually bring up, the atomic bomb. The splitting of the atom, rather, and nuclear fusion and nuclear fission. But it probably did start with fire. I mean, if you can't keep a handle on this, even as a prehistoric human, that could be the end of your village, So yeah, maybe that's why they were telling the story. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure you can trace quite a direct ancestry from the splitting of the atom to taming fire all the way back in the day.
Hey, that'd be a cool sci-fi story. Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, I think that if the ancient Greeks, with all their, cautionary tales and mythology, existed in the 21st century, I think they'd be absolutely mortified.
Yeah. Why weren't you listening, for God's sake? Like, why? Yeah. Did we have to put it explicitly for you? Yeah, maybe it was too vague, for sure. Well, there's also the, I promised I wouldn't go on any rambling segues, but did you see Prometheus, this movie that came out a while ago, the kind of Alien sequel, I think? And
the Ridley Scott one, yeah.
Yeah, and there was, I think it was like a promotional video that went with it that was up online. It was a kind of mock TED Talk done by Guy Pearce was he something to do with Weyland Yutani, like the corporation in Alien or something? I can't remember.
Yes, he was. I think he was the founder.
Weyland, that was it. Yeah, you're right. He was. And he did this absolutely brilliant, in this mock TED Talk, he sort of goes through the founding inventions of mankind and fire to gunpowder, blah blah blah. But it is exactly that point of just how horribly deadly every single cornerstone invention of the human species has been so far.
Yeah, definitely. So we've sort of talked a bit about the origins of I don't know if you can call it transhumanism proper, but the sort of where these ideas first came in humans to start modifying the natural world. I think you could say that's
that's definitely a fair definition. Yeah, I think so.
So going from the origins of this, I think we can ask, what is the endpoint for transhumanism? What do they want to achieve? What's their ultimate goal?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to speak for all of them, of course, but I think in the same way as if you go into any political philosophy, I've come across a fair few different schools of transhumanism. So the school kind of close to my heart are the more sort of I guess they grew out of the sort of 60s left wing, I suppose, the sort of more eco movement, who would like to use sort of uplift technologies, I suppose, transhuman technologies, to try and eradicate the more unpleasant aspects of the human condition. But I'm sure there's kind of the anarchists as well, and I'm sure there's the more, I don't know, neoliberal or whoever side of it who would like to use it to make us better traders of wares or something. But I think, to be honest, that their goals differ radically depending on which particular school they belong to. I personally, and I'd certainly like to hear the same from you, but if we had to triage what we might do with coming technologies, which might be a good idea to talk about first, actually, I think it would be to try and modify the more unpleasant aspects of the human condition, of physical suffering and mental suffering. I think we should definitely start there before we start trying to send our consciousness to the stars. But yeah, right back at you, man. What do you, from your understanding of all this, what do you reckon at the base of it, what do you reckon the transhumanists and those cats are after?
If I can borrow a quote from Nick Bostrom, who I think is one of the founding members of transhumanism.
You bet, yeah.
Along with several others who we can get into later in the talk. He says, if human beings are constituted of matter obeying the same laws of physics that operate outside us, then it should be in principle possible to learn to manipulate human nature in the same way that we manipulate external objects. And I think that sort of goes some way to explain how it's this idea of taming the objective state of nature and imposing this human element on it. Like the universe isn't just something that exists out there that is just passive and that we have no control over. It's something that we can actually learn to manipulate, and especially with regards to our own biology.
Yeah.
It's something that we can actually tinker with and mess around with and see what we can do.
And it's strange to think it's universe modifying universe. I mean, ultimately, like that's the weird part. A universe trying to modify its own will, I guess.
Yeah, that's quite a weird thought to think about.
Well, yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. That's a grand quote. Well, the more I've been thinking about this recently, the more it scares the shit out of me that there's the thing I'm most scared of is feedback loops in more or less any human system. So I'm fairly sure that we'll get to a crisis, it may be centuries away, but where you can imagine every time we invent a new technology, it with it comes a new need that it provides. So, for example, the current crisis of attention that we're living in at the moment, and the age of misinformation, I suppose you could say, about social media, maybe some would say, this didn't exist before the internet. This didn't exist before mass communication. So with every technology, it brings a new need, something else that we need to be wary of, to be careful of, with the benefits. And I imagine that transhumanism in nature modifying itself, as we will be doing as transhumanists, I suppose, it's really hard to imagine what someone 150 years from now, with all the self-modification technology they might have access to, with the kind of Promethean downside of that is, you know what I mean? New problems they need to solve, new threats that will come up. You know, I don't know, like if it's something in cyberpunk or whatever, even in the sci-fi we have today, that you can have your mind hacked remotely or something like that, as a silly example. But you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's this sort of idea that, you know, once we learned how to split the atom, of course we can use that to go on and make nuclear power, sustainable energy, or we could go on and make an atomic bomb.
Decimate cities, yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. So it's this careful process of navigation and treading a fine line between going one direction that's potentially massively profitable for humankind, and then going down this radically other direction that might spell mankind's destruction. Yeah. Well, we might need to look out for that one. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, hopefully it's something that appears to us and we can recognize it before it's too late. I mean,
yeah. Well, can I butt in and play pseudo-host for a second and ask if you had like a wish list of transhuman technologies, if it was in an ideal world where engineering limitations just don't exist, is there something you'd like to see for yourself selfishly, or for humanity selflessly, or whatever?
If I can answer that in the negative.
Oh yeah.
My favorite. Don't think I don't think that it would be a positive thing to erase, I won't say suffering, but I'll say pain and maybe boredom, things along those lines that we commonly perceive as negative. I think those are things that I think I've mentioned this in other podcasts I've done, either on my channel or on another, that I don't think this kind of idea of the hedonic treadmill is something that we can eradicate.
Oh, okay. So not just that we shouldn't, but that you think it's impossible to do this.
I personally think it's impossible. But let's assume that we can. I really don't see the benefit of a race that's completely happy and satisfied all the time. Yeah. I think that completely eradicates any need for curiosity and creativity.
Sure.
I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I guess there are, so I take most of my stance on this from a philosopher called David Pearce, and I think it's the hedonistic imperative, which I think you and I have chatted about before, and he's advocating for the abolition of all. It sounds really radical to say out loud. I'm not necessarily pushing this, but I find it quite inspiring. Advocating for the abolition of all suffering on the planet across species, which is it sounds like a pretty crazy idea. But his position is that you could potentially ratchet up the amount of, I don't know, bliss or euphoria that humans could experience without necessarily losing the the negative. I forget what he calls them. The not the negative feels, but the negative aspect. As he said, like boredom, for example. I mean, especially because boredom, dissatisfaction, feeling I don't know, uncomfortable, getting that gut sense that something is wrong, or even you could even argue like anxiety or depression or really unpleasant mental states. These probably began from an evolutionarily useful place. Like they were to try and signal to you that, the beneficial aspect of physical pain is obvious, right? If you've got your hand in a fire or something. It's just that most of these systems have run out of control. So we've got to the point where people might live in chronic pain, chronic physical pain, for no obvious reason besides a genetic abnormality or an injury or something like this. So probably most of these things, and like you were saying, boredom, and sorry, the other qualities you listed, I'm sure they began from a good place, but it's just more if we could either voluntarily switch them off or modify them so that they're beneficial to being more creative, but without feeling. I mean, the state of humans at the moment, I would argue, is not we're not doing our best in terms of our evolutionary makeup. I don't think. Like a lot of us do seem to be quite unhappy for quite a lot of the time, and if we could fix that technologically, without the world going to hell, that would certainly be pretty. That'd be pretty utopian, is what that would be, and potentially really dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah, I broadly agree with you. I wouldn't say for a minute that just because it has been evolutionarily beneficial for us, that means it's beneficial now. Absolutely. I don't think that's the case. Yeah. Maybe it's the case for some things, but as a blanket statement, I don't think that holds. And yeah, I would, if we got to the stage with our technology where we could eradicate, I'll say, unnecessary human suffering, then I think I would be an advocate for that. Things like extreme anxiety, depression, mental disorders, things like this, just to, I don't want to say level the playing field, because that implies that some of them are qualitatively worse than others, but just to allow everyone to have an equal opportunity to pursue the good life as they saw fit, I would say. That is something I would be an advocate for.
I think that's a really wise and really admirable way to put it. Yeah, that's great. And it kind of seems to preserve a notion of personal liberty there as well. Yeah, I could get behind that for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Though, I mean, to throw it back then, another thing to worry about maybe as well, that I think this might be a possible solution to the Fermi paradox, at least in some cases of why aren't there more aliens out there, or any aliens apparently, as far as we can tell so far, is that you can imagine if you had a button in front of you, like one of those, wasn't there some famous experiment with rats and electrodes? Yeah, and this sounds like some popular myth, but I'm fairly sure there's some basis to it, because that's a brilliant starting place for a story. But rats that would generally opt for either, I guess, cocaine water, or would opt for pressing the button that activates the electrode of the pleasure center of their brain over and over again. But you have to wonder what happens if we did isolate, say, the molecular structure of bliss, or we isolated how to produce long-lasting, undying bliss in the human brain. If we'd actually get anything done after that, I mean, if you could, I don't know if I'd stop pushing that button. If you can feel the best you've ever felt all day, constantly, and no external... you can see where I'm going with this already, but how much interest would you really have in external pursuits,
Yeah, exactly. I definitely agree with you there. I just think that if a mind is completely satisfied all the time, then it just eliminates any drive to become better or to do something interesting.
Yeah, and you have no kind of negative history or anything unpleasant to look back on that you want to avoid, even as a basic pain avoidance mechanism. You don't have any emotional pain to look back on, so there's nothing to inform your future decisions.
Yeah, you could never really expand as a person and sort of stretch out to the limits of what you're capable of.
Yeah. If
you never have any bad experiences on which to draw from.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. Well, hopefully we're both moderates in that regard, then that's good. That's good to know.
Yeah. So we've had a bit of a discussion about the origins of transhumanism, perhaps, and their goals and where we're headed. So I think we should talk a bit about the actual technology. How are we going to modify ourselves, and how are we going to improve ourselves? And I think you wanted to kick things off by mentioning Moore's law.
Yeah, I'm no expert on this at all. It only comes from my days as a huge Kurzweil fan. So certainly my prophet about 10 years ago or so was Ray Kurzweil, who I think he'd been around for ages before, but I think he properly broke through with a book called The Singularity is Near, where it was drawing together all these transhuman ideologies, I suppose, transhuman threads. And quite a lot of it was built on Moore's law, which I cannot remember I should have looked this up earlier. I can't remember off the top of my head. As I remember, it was something like it's the amount of computing power you can buy. This is going to get corrected so hard, but the amount of computing power you can buy for $1, I think, doubles every 18 months or something to that effect. But nevertheless, whatever the specifics were that I'm too silly to remember, it was essentially that computing power begins accelerating exponentially. The amount you can purchase anyway every year, say, begins accelerating exponentially. So even though you can't necessarily predict what the technologies of the 2060s will be in their function, you can predict that we'll have X amount of computing power and it will be insanely powerful. And it's a bit like, do you remember this story about was it a Chinese emperor who, I think someone had done some good deed and he said, what would you like in return? And the smart-ass wise man or whoever said, I would like you to put a grain of rice on the first square of a chessboard and then 2 grains of rice on the second and keep going, doubling each time. And by the time you get to, whatever the 40th or whatever it is, there won't be enough grains of rice that you could possibly put on this thing, It would just be completely infeasible. So the computing power will get to that same state. And so transhumanism in that sense kind of became a huge dreaming chamber for all the possible things that we could do with that much computation at our fingertips. If we could have little computers floating around inside of us, nanobots or whatever, say they're the size of red blood cells that have more computing power individually than I don't know 10 iPhones or a million iPhones or whatever it might be. What would we potentially do to ourselves in that regard? Though I should say, and I don't mean to throw shade on the guy, onto Ray Kurzweil at all, but he made the interesting choice of making a bunch of specific predictions about what the next decades would be like. And I will shut up in a second, but sorry, I'm just my feline is trying to attack me. Hey, chill out. And he made some interesting predictions that were technologically feasible, but politically it didn't go that way. So I think by now we're supposed to live in a paperless economy. So no one's really going to own books anymore. And sorry, my cat's tearing up the rug. No one's going to own books anymore, and e-readers will take over, blah, blah, blah. But we already know how that went, which is, I think the e-reader market, as a silly example, saturated. And I, for one, went back to books. I don't know about you, but I just preferred the texture of them. I like the feeling of when you finish a book and you can look back physically on how you actually persevered with something. So a lot of his predictions seem to have been marred, not so much by where we got to now in the 2020s with computing power, but actually with how the human political situation turned out and how human preferences turned out, and it's that, again, another ridiculous side rant. But sorry, over to you. Sorry, man.
Yeah, I think it's one of those situations where just because you can do something, it doesn't mean we necessarily
Once again,
will.
You've put it so much better than that. That's exactly it. Yes, that's exactly it.
No, but thank you. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what you think about this. I think I vaguely remember reading somewhere that it was a couple of years ago now, but I think it was the first year where the computing power of various phones and laptops and things didn't conform to Moore's law.
Yeah.
So maybe law is the wrong word for it. Maybe it's more of a, well, I don't know what you'd call it. But I suppose that does beg the question, is there, do you think, an upper limit on our technology? Is there a point where we can reach where it's just so powerful and so efficient that we have no idea what to do with it?
Oh, okay, like the upper limit in terms of it just becomes so powerful that we almost can't find a function for it in a way.
Well, sorry, I suppose that was two separate questions.
Oh no, that would be a really cool idea. But if it's an upper limit on Moore's law continuing and actually getting to it, going into like the I think what's it called, the AI winter or whatever, or I guess a transistor winter. I think there is some. Again, I'm not the expert, but I think there is some discussion that we're already there because it's at the moment, even though we've moved through different computational paradigms. So we were using vacuum tubes before we were using transistors. I think there's now at least there is every decade, I think, but there is now a predicted upper limit on the amount of transistors you can fit inside a certain space. I'm a complete idiot about this. I don't know. But I often hear the rebuttal, which I don't agree with, that, okay, fine, we'll find the upper limit with current transistor technology or whatever, or current electronics, but quantum computing will come along soon enough and blah, blah, blah. And that's why the argument is kind of strange, at least from Kurzweil, that I don't think it's just his argument, but that side of things, that he's making out that you can track Moore's law before transistors and that you can allegedly track Moore's law afterwards. And magically, not necessarily magically, but some new paradigm will turn up to carry on Moore's law, which is kind of weird because it sort of implies like some, like what was it, like Hegel's spirit of history, like something pushing humanity on.
Yeah.
It kind of feels the same, that there's some like magic, some spiritual, some magical computer demon that's pushing humanity further and further up, and it will just keep giving us new technologies. So no, there are some great sci-fi stories about that, where we get to a point where we do hit a wall, and no amount of innovation will actually push us across it. And that would kill in a way that would kill a lot of our dreams of AI, of what we can do with neural nets, and especially the more exotic stuff like uploading minds, for example, if we just can't push over that limit. I think there's definitely some truth in that claim, though, because just a cursory look back at the last sort of 50 years of computing, and you start with these massive machines, and they fill the size of a room, they're 10 tons heavy, and they can only do simple calculations. Obviously, since then, computers have become smaller and smaller. I mean, you see that fact repeated online, that there's more power in an iPhone than there was on the Apollo 11 computers. In the whole of NASA, I think, yeah.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And everything gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And I wonder if there's a point where new technologies come in to replace our existing ones, like you mentioned with quantum computing. And things start to get bigger again for a while, and then we learn to refine and we learn to make things more efficient, and it becomes smaller again. So I wonder if there's this kind of cycle through history of things getting massive and then getting tiny again.
That might make a fun sci-fi story. The museum of expanding and shrinking computers, where you modelled computers over history by just their size up until you get to the point of turning red giants into computers or something like that. But yeah, no, that's a really cool idea for sure. I don't know too much about the more visionary paradigms for computing. I mean, I've heard some talk about DNA computing. Do you know much more about this than other directions we might go?
I've read certain things about this. I don't know much about it, but from what I understand, you can fit like terabytes worth of information you can code it into DNA down to this really, really tiny scale.
Yeah.
And so that would be one thing, and it would kind of persist throughout time.
Okay.
They would have so much more longevity than our current computers, and it would be protected in this format. I don't know if that's DNA or if I'm confusing it with something else.
I know there's some talk of doing that with crystallography, doing it with crystals, I think. But man, there are a lot of very angry. If there are computer scientists listening to this, I imagine they're very angry at this point at what we're doing to their field. But
well, we can only apologise. We're not experts in the field.
No, we both humbly admit that. I hope. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, I find that's quite a cool idea, is because people always talk about DNA being the kind of the coding blocks for animals and humans and the various creatures it creates and everything. And it's kind of going full circle, where the universe kind of coded these instructions into our DNA to make us what we are, to make us human with all our biological functioning and everything. And then we've sort of gone full circle to use the universe's own trick, and then code things using DNA into these little computers.
Well, I don't, because as well as a computer scientist, I'm also not a geneticist. But I wonder how optimal DNA is as a computational substrate or whatever. Because if it turned out to be extremely optimal, I have no idea. But if it did, that would certainly be another point for nature, that she somehow discovered an extremely efficient mode of at least encoding information. And considering how miniaturized it is, it certainly seems pretty efficient, except for all the junk DNA and the errors and whatnot. But yeah, and also I guess likewise, if there are other species out there, if they're using very different different systems to us that aren't even proteins or some other code of life or something like that. But yeah, it is strange that I was going to say the universe reaching around, but that's perhaps not quite the right word there. But humans turning back on ourselves to use our own technology built in. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, just to assume a physicalist viewpoint for a second, if we assume that everything about our biology and about our DNA can explain all of who we are as humans, then if DNA can give rise to something like consciousness in terms of the subjective sense, then I would say that's a point in favor of DNA being massively efficient as a computational substrate, as you said.
Well, it's. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's unless there is more in the source that we don't know about, and that's, I guess, we've already done that one a bit. It's miraculous that it can give rise to conscious brains. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely crazy. Certainly, currently, silicon can't do that, as far as we're aware. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Maybe the reason we can't create a mind using silicon, create a truly conscious artificial intelligence, is because what's needed is this biological substrate instead. Maybe we've been looking in the wrong direction. Maybe that's the direction we'll end up going in the future. Maybe quantum computing's just it's what we think is the future now, but in reality, maybe thousands of years down the line, we'll end up with biological computers.
Yeah, hey, that would be wonderful. It would be so unexpected as well, with our current visions of the future. I should say as a caveat, by the way, I know that quantum computing as it stands today, I think it is extremely application specific. So it's not that we'll end up with, I'm not saying this at you, I just mean because I feel like it rarely gets brought up in these conversations, when someone whips out the quantum computing card like I did earlier, in that it doesn't seem to be a miraculous improvement on our current computational technologies. Rather, it might be, I don't know, in 50 years or something, that you have a little quantum computing unit that can sort through lists incredibly fast or whatever, but it will be a supplement, I think, the way it's going anyway, to current computation. But yes, where you were going with the biological computing question, apologies for the third time for the segue, but it reminds me of a book by Roger Penrose, the physicist.
Yes.
Yeah, he wrote a book called The Emperor's New Mind, I think it was called, and he was arguing with I think the co-author was an anesthesiologist, I think, from memory. I hope he was. Anyway, they were both arguing that consciousness is a result of I think they were carbon nanotubes, I think, but essentially that consciousness was quantum mechanical. It was quantum mechanical in nature. And that, I only say that because with you talking about us not actually being able to produce consciousness on computers, and since we're talking about transhumanism, we're probably going to go there anyway, I hope. Maybe it turns out that we just can't upload minds on silicon. And maybe, like you said, the biological substrate is the only possible substrate to on which minds can be run, if you like. But I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea, actually. I hadn't quite connected the dots until you said it.
Yeah, so neither had I.
Yeah, maybe the reason we're finding it so difficult to create artificial intelligence and true artificial consciousness is because we're trying to do it on these on the basis of silicon and quantum computing, if indeed quantum computing is applicable, when in reality we're supposed to be doing it on biological substrates. But just to take the idea of mind uploading, to take a more philosophical, conceptual approach to it, if we agree that on the current route we're going down, mind uploading is essentially useless, for lack of a better term,
I like it.
Perhaps all we can hope to do then is create an artificial copy. But would you say, if we could hypothetically create a perfect copy of your mind and then upload that, would that copy still be you? And would you be happy to die in order for that copy to live on?
Yeah, I bet there's going to be in this century, there's going to be a lot of cults based on this, because it seems like the kind of transhuman version of the what was the whatever the ghastly cult was, where they all drank Kool-Aid to go and ascend to the alien mothership or whatever. You could imagine a cult based around scanning yourself. Oh no, that was the plot of a video game actually called Soma, which I highly recommend. That you would take your mind state copy or whatever and upload it, and then kill your biological self so that the continuity continues. Yeah, I would say as a little get workaround to consciousness not necessarily being able to, that you couldn't reproduce on a silicon substrate, on a computational substrate. You could imagine though still that you could. It sounds really silly, but you could upload a perfect simulation of. So you could model a biological construct, model your brain, even down to the atom, in a perfect universe where you had infinite computational power. So that on a computer, it was basically running in exactly the same fashion, a model of reality, if you like. And I don't know what the difference would be between base reality and computational reality, because as far as the computer simulation is concerned, it's still a biological thing. So whatever all I mean is all the limits. That's nuts, but I just mean the limitations that we think there might be, they may not be in computational space. But no, I wouldn't, to answer your question, no, I wouldn't trust that was me, to be totally honest, because I don't think there's preserved continuity. I think I'd arbitrarily say that continuity is preserved through spatial tracking. I mean, it's the same as that. What's that? I don't know if it's a myth, but about your cells being, every cell in your body, except your neurons, I think, being replaced every 7 years or so. If I don't know, whatever it is, there's going to be a set number. If it's 14 years or 50, it doesn't really matter for the sake of the argument. But you're certainly not most of the same cells that you were when you were 10. That's for sure. So in a way, we've kind of already undergone that change. I don't know. How about you? I guess to put it a bit more crassly, does it scare the shit out of you? Because it scares the shit out of me. But yeah.
Yeah, it does. I mean, there's philosophical workarounds. It depends really on what kind of theory of identity you want to use. Yeah. Whether I probably favor the same one as you, in that you have to be able to trace a straight line through space-time. But then again, there are other theories. I can't quite remember the name of the guy who came up with them, but that allow for a broken line as long as it's kind of a perfect recreation.
Sure.
And the other one was destroyed. If it's made from if you could theoretically deconstruct yourself to the atom and then reconstruct yourself in exactly the same configuration, arguably that's still you, although I wouldn't really say so.
I guess the first thing would be that as soon as you switch that, as soon as you activate that uploaded mind, presumably they're going to start deviating from the biological version of you, because they're going to be having different experiences. So I guess in a way you'd be more like, if you're still alive anyway, you'd be more like identical twins to begin with than the same person, I suppose. But yeah, I don't know. And also not to mention that presumably if you were living in a computer environment, whatever utopia it was, you'd have, well, I don't know, I guess you could choose to have a radically enhanced intelligence, or to still have your human brain or whatever, but that would make a huge difference as well, you'd imagine. I think you were going for is it called pattern identity, that as long as you're the same, as long as you're roughly the same kind of mind and that you still have your memories, is that what you meant, that you could still be considered the same person?
Yeah, it's this kind of idea like the transporter in Star Trek,
that's
like
it,
you're destroyed and then recreated.
That's my nightmare. How do people go along? How would anyone go along with this? Even in a perfect future, how would anyone step into that thing? I don't get it. It seems insane. It just seems horrible. There was a really good, when I was a bit younger. I used to listen to. It sounds so posh, but like BBC Radio 4 they used to do these afternoon plays, and there was a really good one years ago about in the future where there are teleporters. And everyone knows that you get destroyed on one end and recreated on the other to preserve continuity. But a woman is taking her first trip abroad to Australia or something in the teleporter, and she's a bit nervous. And when she gets in, she's scanned. But as she's scanned, there's a bomb threat or something in the facility, and her copy is materialized on the other end, but she isn't destroyed. So it's kind of the perfect aquarium, I guess, for that kind of. That kind of question, because you both claim personhood, right? You both feel that you have the right to live. you both feel like you don't want to be murdered, you know. So yeah, I don't know. Well, I was going to say, it reminds me slightly of it with the many worlds interpretation in quantum mechanics. If you could talk to the millions of versions of you living next to you in alternate realities, you know, I guess it's the same question. Do we consider them our siblings, or, you know, just versions of ourselves that deviated in some other direction? But anyway, sorry, yeah, go on. Sorry.
Presumably at the point where she's recreated on the other side, in that instant, and only in that instant, they could be considered the same person because they have exactly the same memories and exactly the same everything else. From that moment on, then it would start to deviate as they would experience different things and have different ideas and different thoughts, so you couldn't really consider them as identical. But even at that very first instant when she was recreated on the other side in Australia, they're not identical because they're in a different space. Their spatial location has changed. So yeah, I take massive issues with this, I think you called it pattern tracking identity. But yeah, I much prefer the theory that says you have to have an unbroken continuous line through space to call yourself the same person.
Yeah, I think being on Team Human, I'd agree with that one, and it seems a lot less scary, yeah, for sure. But it does. I don't want to hijack this thing, but it does then kind of raise the question as well. Say, you know, we were able to make mind copies and upload them if this was possible. Also, like, what rights do you grant them? Do you if they behave like us, do we give them human rights? I mean, do we actually afford these? And I think you and I talked about this before, but can you switch them off at will? I mean, like, is that tantamount to murder or whatever? Because they would presumably act like us. They would presumably have all the same interests and social needs as we do. They'd probably be, you know, orders of magnitude smarter if they wanted to be, if presumably. Yeah, I wonder how our perception of human rights would change in that event, you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, presumably they have the idea that they don't particularly want to be murdered.
Yeah.
or to stop existing.
Kind of a fashion. Yeah, they're kind of into it.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, would you call it murder? Probably. I mean, if it's a perfect duplicate or copy of your mind, then yeah, I guess you would call it murder.
Yeah. Well, you would hope so. Otherwise, it would expose some really messed up holes in our morality. I think if they act like humans and we're still happy to switch them off, we'd have to start asking ourselves some very pressing questions about how we deal with other humans. Though I would say that the second that this becomes possible, and the second that we can confirm that we can do this, that they really are uploaded versions of humans, or whether they're AIs or whatever, but the second we can confirm they're conscious, I think that's probably the end of the species. I think that's probably going to be a very quiet doomsday, because, I mean, they would just have such a radical advantage over the biological human population, don't you think?
Well, this was another question I was sort of hoping we'd naturally move on to, is that would we call them humans at all? Are they still considered human, or are they, well, to rephrase the question, are they the next stage in human evolution, or are they a new species entirely?
Well, I'm an idiot teleologist, if that's the thing. I think there is a teleology. I think there's something pulling us from the end of time, not in a spiritual way necessarily, but I think probably when we look back, or when something looks back in a few thousand years, biological, it sounds dark and I don't want it to be true, but I can't help but think that Homo sapiens will have been a useful, a very worthy of gratitude species for shepherding in the next stage in the development of intelligence in the universe ultimately. So I think we're probably a very fine slice in the development of intelligence. Is that a bit too pessimistic? What do you think?
Well, I would kind of argue that it would be analogous to the way we look back at our ancient ancestors who were hunter-gatherers. It's not as if we look back on them and say, oh, they were so primitive, oh, they didn't do this, they didn't do that. We sort of just passively regard them as a necessary stage in evolution, and that we've improved from them now. But then again, with these uploaded minds, or I don't know if we want to call them transhumans, hypothetically, they're orders of magnitude above our levels of intelligence now.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it goes a bit beyond saying that this is just the next stage in our evolution. Just to draw on a bit of philosophy, I think it was Wittgenstein that wrote about your form of life. So it's kind of like Aristotle's idea of the soul, not in any spiritual sense, because Aristotle was a naturalist, but he argued that the human soul is the kind of the blueprint for what we are as a biological being, and all the things we're capable of, if we so choose to do it and develop our virtues in the relevant sense. And then, so Wittgenstein's idea sort of builds on this, that humans have a particular form of life, other animals have a different form of life because they're different creatures. I think that these transhumans would be so radically different from us, and so much higher on the intelligence scale, and they'd have so many different opportunities available to them, perhaps even, a massive range of emotions that they could potentially feel that we could never dream about. I would say that qualifies them for having a different form of life. And I would say they're a different species entirely.
Well, and presumably as well, they would be the first species ever on the planet or off the planet that could that would have access to immediate self-modification. And so I'm not saying you were saying this, but they presumably wouldn't just be one homogeneous species. They could, and a single individual could go over millions of iterations of themselves, change themselves millions of times over in the time it takes you and I to have a cup of tea, to go in and modify the emotional blueprint of your own soul, essentially, and also the scary part, I think, is that you could go in and modify, again, presumably what you want to modify. So you could change your own will, you could change your own desires, and then God knows what happens then. You if you had like a society of artilects, of artificial minds, presumably they'd all be subspecies of their own, or millions of different species. It'd be pretty cool to live as an anthropologist in that society, I guess, anyway. But yeah, and also, not to forget, I'm completely on board with what you said. That's a great example about the difference between us and earlier humans, so Neanderthals, well, cousins anyway, or whoever. But I would say, not as a criticism at all, it's just what came into my head, that the difference between them and us is certainly a very massive temporal difference, in that it took so long to get from them to us. But the intellectual difference doesn't seem to have been that huge. Whereas, like you said, the difference between us and whatever comes next, if things go in that direction, it would be unimaginable. It'd be unimaginable if you had access to that kind of computation as a hybrid of your consciousness. God knows what surely we'd just be slime by comparison. It's whatever, slightly glorified slime with hats.
Slimes with nice top hats and canes and monocles.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, and that if I could fire this one at you, that's kind of where I'm going with this. Is it the part that worries me about that is how I don't think we're particularly nice to our animal mates. So factory farming as one example. We do feel some obligation globally towards mammals that can clearly feel pain, and others, but we don't seem to feel it that seriously. So if more intelligence doesn't necessarily lead to being more passive or more compassionate, it's a bit worrying how our digital descendants, whatever they might be, might view us.
Yeah, there's always that classic metaphor of we don't care about the ants that we see on the ground. Something that's so radically higher on the evolutionary ladder than we are. Why would they care about us? Should they care about us? Or perhaps it comes along with having such a radically different level of intelligence that maybe they've got some sort of sympathy for us. Maybe they'll treat us nicely. Maybe current Homo sapiens will be sort of like their pets or something.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we get to live in a nice transhuman zoo. Yeah, having all the beer we could possibly drink. That would be nice. Yeah, for sure.
Oh, that sounds fantastic.
yeah. I was thinking about this a bit today while I was tidying up in anticipation of this conversation, and I was thinking a nice optimistic slant might be that for all I've just dissed humans for being such dicks to animals sometimes, we do have a benevolent streak when it comes to our kids, obviously, and when it comes to ailing humans, when it comes to just animals on the planet. There are plenty of folks out there who would gladly be kind to mammals or whoever else. And, the average person wouldn't want to mistreat a dog or a cat or, domesticated animals. I don't think they would anyway, unless you're psychopathic. So at least, I don't know, there's some proof in us is what I mean. There's some road testing going on there that intelligence can lead to high degrees of compassion. I would just hope that the digital minds of the future or whoever would have that in even more abundance and wouldn't end up like the Borg or something. Which also begs the question, I guess, we both keep using the pronoun they, like for continuing to be individuals. Would they want to continue to be individuals? I mean, we only do this because it was probably useful for sexual diversity, right? Like that seems to be why why we use the mode of sex that we do, because it leads to amazing changes evolutionarily. And I wonder if they would, do you reckon they would even, I mean, wouldn't there be an incentive to kind of amalgamate into like a sort of collective organism? Resistance is futile, etc., etc.
Yeah, like a hive mind kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think us current humans with our current levels of intelligence and everything else, we psychologically have a sense of self, and we give preference to our own actions and events and objects that we find interesting, and we prioritize certain things based on how they relate to us. I think that's an ingrained psychological aspect of our lives. But yeah, I mean, these transhumans who are leagues above us, it's a good question. Would they feel the need to individualize themselves and have different personalities and everything? Would personality still be a thing? Would maybe they find it's a much greater benefit if they all sort of amalgamate their consciousnesses together to become this one massive thinking thing.
I certainly in a really dark eldritch way, I reckon it would go that direction. Yeah, there was a book, Arthur C. Clarke. There's a book called The Light of Other Days years ago that I'll spoil just slightly, where someone cracked wormhole technology, and you could make these little, I think there were only a few, the size of a few molecules. They were tiny. You couldn't see them when you opened a wormhole. And they used them for communication to begin with, blah, blah, blah. I can't recommend it enough. It's a great book. But at some point, as a little spoiler, people start using them to communicate mentally. And there develops this kind of like, not subspecies. What's the prefix for like something? So a species alongside humans then, I suppose, is a nice way to put it. A paraspecies or something like that, who are constantly, permanently telepathic. And they just find it more pleasurable because they begin to feel like just a single cell among a collection of, I guess in the same way as, we are basically just machines of infinite cooperation. Like your body is just all these different systems working in tandem that all seem to have their own interests, though they aren't probably conscious. These people sort of ended up feeling like that each individual was just a sort of a part of the whole. And they were quite distressed by the thought of having to go back to being a singular thing, if you like. But it'd be a bit depressing if we go that way. Parties would be pretty shit in that respect, I suppose, if we did go in that direction. But
yeah, no, just to bring in some of the stuff I'm studying at the minute.
Yeah, please do.
We're doing a bit of we're studying phenomenology, and there's a massive emphasis in the phenomenological tradition about empathy and how we relate to other people. And I'm sure everyone has the experience of when you've been in a particularly shit conversation and it's not really flowing very well, and the other person's being that. No, no, no. You made me feel really self-conscious now. No, of course not. No. Okay, so someone's been in a really good conversation and everything's flowing really well, and you're really sort of gelling with that other person, and you're being expressive and they're being expressive, and you can kind of you directly perceive their mental states. And in phenomenology, this is what's called shared interaffectivity. So it's this idea that when you're having a great conversation with someone, you live in this shared space.
Oh, cool.
And I think there's a sort of qualitative distinction between a good conversation and a really shit conversation. And maybe it's the case that one level up from a really great conversation is just something analogous to telepathic communication.
Yeah, it's like one
there
wrong
wouldn't
on
be
the ladder to God, almost. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, because obviously there's limits as to what we can express with our bodies, just as there's limits to what we can express with just our voices we're hearing over the phone. And yeah, maybe one stage in the transhuman ladder is just to completely eradicate all these barriers and just say, look, you can telepathically communicate. You know each other's thoughts.
Well, and first of all, did you say, was the second one the interaffectivity? I haven't heard that one before.
Yes.
Oh, right on. Okay, I have to start trying to slip that into conversation. That sounds ace. But yeah, well, it leads back into exactly what we were talking about at the beginning, trying to define this, and that is the ultimate goal of transhumanism, I suppose, is to throw off our genetic shackles. And you would imagine one of the first things you would do, if you could do that, was to throw off the sort of the currently immutable barrier that we have between the fact that you and I are relegated to using. Well, first of all, we're throwing our voices across space at the speed of light almost, which is pretty cool. But I just mean, even then, if we're sat in the same room, we'd still have to put everything in silly, mouthy word noises, which will always be a barrier. And you would imagine if you didn't have to concede to that, you wouldn't. I mean, that would be incredible. But if you did reach ultimate interaffectivity or whatever else, wouldn't you sort of start automatically becoming the same person? I mean, if right now we could literally just share thoughts directly, which would make for a very weird podcast, I guess, but all the same, you would basically just become like a kind of meta brain, wouldn't you? Like a kind of meta consciousness, if you're communicating that fast, if you're communicating that honestly, and if there's no, the division between, inner and outer. I feel like that's kind of what you meant with connection in phenomenology. That is the beginning. What you were describing sounded like the beginning of becoming a shared mind, almost.
Yeah. So there's obviously, as we're talking now, I can tell you my thoughts, not perfectly, because my thoughts are mine, and I'm constrained by the limits of my body and my corporeal form, however awful that is, and and yeah. So there's something that makes my thoughts mine and your thoughts yours, is that they're confined to me and you respectively. But yeah, if there could be such a thing as telepathic communication, and I have direct access to your thoughts, then there wouldn't really be such a thing as you or me, that the division between me and you as our respective selves would sort of break down. And so yeah, it would be like a meta brain or a hive mind.
I reckon, yeah. I'm not necessarily advocating it, but yeah, it's and the to stay on phenomenology for a second as well, the amount of empathy you would have for someone. I mean, empathy seems to be, uncharitably anyway, it seems to be an evolved response to hold the tribe together, to try and foster, communities, I suppose, and to try and make sure we actually repair each other and don't let each other starve, which would be nice. And yeah, presumably it would just foster the most, if you could actually, if I trod on your foot or whatever else, and I actually felt the pain at the same time, I'd probably stop doing that. It's to a degree. Yeah. So to take a bit of a tangent and to put it to our philosopher in chief here, to take it in the direction of bioethics or whatever else. If say the UN or whoever else, if say so CRISPR, that is becoming a pretty hot topic at the moment, and genetic modification, potentially growing out of control. Presumably, at some point, we're going to all have to sit down and work out a charter for. I know there are already, ethical boards for this kind of stuff in lots of countries, anyway, and some not. Still, presumably, at some point, we're going to need to get together and agree what's kosher and what isn't kosher when it comes to human genetic modification. But I wonder, as the moral philosopher here, if you had some thoughts about, even though we can't predict what we'll be capable of in 50 years, we still need to potentially draft the legislation for it and draft the guidelines. what if with roads we can go down and roads we can't? I wondered if you had some thoughts about that.
Yeah, CRISPR is something that's quite controversial in bioethics, I would say, at least from the stuff I've read about it. There's a massive discussion as to whether CRISPR can actually cure disease.
Shit.
So we talk about, yeah, exactly. Well, not in the sense that it doesn't work, but in the sense of the kind of pretentious philosophical sense of whether it can actually cure disease.
Oh.
So there's this question, because there was that case a while back in China where this scientist genetically modified embryos to be resistant to HIV, I think it was.
Yeah, I think so.
And he didn't tell the rest of the scientific community, and the children were born, and by all accounts they do seem to be resistant to HIV.
Yeah.
But there was massive outrage that it seems to be a moral line in the sand that we cannot genetically engineer children.
Sure.
Because it does lead into a very slippery slope about designer babies and things. And perhaps we can have that discussion slightly later on. But the point I was getting to was that it wasn't that CRISPR can't cure disease, it was that CRISPR can't save lives.
Okay.
So CRISPR can be used, sorry, that was my mistake. CRISPR can be used to kind of swap out different genes and things. Like, I'm no expert on the technicalities of how it's used, but basically it can alter your DNA basically to make you resistant or to take out perhaps genetically inherited diseases and things like this. But the arguments I've read are that CRISPR can't save lives because, or at least CRISPR isn't the optimal solution for saving lives, because there's always the option not to have children.
Well, I was in the back of my mind, I was like, I wonder what's coming next. I was not predicting that. Okay, right. So
yeah.
Okay.
Well, I when I first read it, I was like, this is a bit strange, but it is true because there seems to be, from what's reported in the media and everything else, that CRISPR is this kind of life-saving cure-all thing, and we can do anything with it. Exactly, and it seems like we have a moral imperative to eradicate these diseases using CRISPR.
So why not eradicate kids? Is that?
Well, yeah, perhaps not eradicate kids, but the option is there not to have children.
Yeah.
And I'm probably messing the argument up a little bit, but that was the basic crux of it. Okay. So, yeah, it's whether I don't really know how well this applies to our transhumanism discussion, but I suppose we could condense that down into a question: just because we can, should we?
Yeah. Maybe I didn't. Maybe it's my brain being small. Maybe I didn't understand the argument entirely, but I felt a bit like you could use that argument not just for disease, but for almost every global problem. That if, climate change gets to the point where it's just making life on Earth intolerable, that rather than geoengineering, fixing the atmosphere or something, you could argue that we could just not have children. Or is there a special case about disease there that I didn't get?
I think what the argument's trying to say, or what I'm failing to say.
No, not at all. No, this is my bad, not yours, for sure.
But yeah, I think it's trying to put across. It seems like, will there be a point in the future where it would be morally wrong to not upgrade an ordinary Homo sapiens into something transhuman?
Yeah.
Because we can hypothetically imagine. Hopefully, we come up with some radical solution to climate change in the future, and it becomes so easy, or rather, it's so easy to be economical, and you have to go out of your way in order to damage the environment. Then it would be morally wrong to do so. No one would say nowadays it's morally wrong to drive a petrol car. Perhaps it's not the best thing you could do. You could buy a Tesla or something, but it's not precisely the most economical for everyone. And you wouldn't say to someone who has a Mercedes-Benz, you've made a morally corrupt decision.
Yeah, kill yourself immediately or whatever. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, exactly. But if we look into the future, and most all of the cars are electric and they're very eco-friendly, and you have to go out of your way in order to buy a gas-guzzling car, then that would then become a morally wrong decision. And so to bring this back to our transhuman front, if there comes a point in the future where pretty much everyone has got some sort of modification that enhances their life to such an amazing degree, and it's easy to do that, would it then become morally wrong to not upgrade your children, say?
Yeah, I was thinking while you're saying this, what might be hang on, my feline is running riot. Listen, philosophy is not for you, or maybe later. Ciao. There you go. So yeah, I was thinking where might be the crossover between a moral imperative and a luxury, and like if CRISPR or let's just say CRISPR becomes this miracle technology. I think it is quite messy at the moment, but if it became some miracle technology in the future, and let's say in a really simplistic world there was a cancer gene, which of course there isn't going to be one, but let's say there was just one, and there was a very easy protocol for snipping it out of embryos' DNA, or even getting there before conception, or whatever the process was. You could imagine a world where it became pretty unethical not to do it for your children, that you might be allowing them to have cancer later on in life if we knew the procedure was safe and blah, blah, blah. So maybe you could argue that was a moral imperative. I think, if I was going to have children and that was possible, I think I'd probably get it done for them in advance, hopefully. But you could imagine it could change over quite quickly to luxuries becoming moral imperatives almost, if, say, enough people who are rich or whatever else, whoever, decided that they wanted, 8-foot high children or something, and that became the new desired aesthetic for humans on the planet. And you can imagine if in that world, if most people were 8 foot or 9 foot high or something, you may be doing your child a disservice if you could choose. This isn't in any way a rant against people who aren't extremely tall or anything like that. I'm not. But I just mean, you could imagine a situation where it became, morally difficult not to do that to your kid because you may be setting them up for a lifetime of social difficulty or something. So the line would get blurry really quickly, if we start trying to find moral imperatives there.
Yeah, I suppose there's the question of the distribution of these technologies between the rich and the poor that we could get onto later. But this problem that you've raised on whether it would be morally wrong not to give your children all the opportunities possible to have a flourishing life, it's something that's applicable in our day and age now. I mean, there's a I don't want to get too bogged down in the ethical details here, but there was a case not too long ago, and it was very vocal on both sides, where this couple, it was a deaf couple, and they got a donation, a sperm donation, but they specifically asked that the donation came from a male who was also deaf.
Okay.
And there was this massive question of whether it was morally wrong for those parents to make their child deaf, obviously without the child's consent, and was that actually limiting their potential future opportunities? Because their argument was that there was this massive capital D deaf culture that the child wouldn't have had access to, that the parents had grown up in. Obviously, they knew everything about. But then on the other side, they were saying that, well, no, you're limiting your child's opportunities by making them deaf. They're not going to have access to all the things that most other people would.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a very interesting question. I'm not going to pretend to have any answers on the topic,
No.
but it's not as if it's something that's just confined to the future. It's a thing that's happening now as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a current issue. I saw it in relation to being able to detect Down syndrome early on, and seeing folks who had Down syndrome often replying to this that they had being able to detect it early on with a developing embryo and being able to abort it early on, and folks with Down syndrome replying, well, our quality of life is fine, thanks. Are you saying we're an aberration or something? So yeah, it's, oh, God knows. I mean, it's just such a grey moral area. God knows with this one. I don't know, but you're absolutely right. Yeah, it isn't a moral quandary of the future. We've been living with it for ages now already. Yeah, you're quite right. Even I was just thinking, I remember when I was young that sometimes I'd go over to my friends' houses and like their parents would be smoking around us, and I don't think anyone would do that now. At least, yeah, I can't think of people doing. I mean, they'd be smoking in the same room, and that's just considered universally fucked up. I think to do around kids in lots of the world anyway. That's changed in the space of about a generation, and that seems like a fairly bad way to. I just meant it as an aside. That seems like a fairly massive disadvantage to give your kids early on, potential lung problems or whatever. So yeah, this certainly isn't the problem of the future. You're quite right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe I don't know if that leads us on to anti-aging as well, because that seems like that's something pretty connected with that. Whether we have a moral obligation to try and get there as fast as possible or not. Do you got some strong feelings on that one?
I don't know. This is one of those things I'm really undecided on. I don't know if you have any strong opinions on that yourself, but I'm not aware of any of the currently standing debates on anti-aging. I know there's arguments on both sides. I'm not really certain of what they are. What do you think?
I certainly couldn't do it justice on either side. I know which side I'm kind of on, but there's one school of thought that I'm pretty sure Nick Bostrom, who we were talking about earlier, popularized, or at least I didn't see it being quite so talked about before he came up with. I know there's one paper, one story, the fable of the dragon tyrant, but he was doing work on this way before, but that was kind of where it entered popular culture, I think, anyway. And the argument was that for as long as we don't spend lots of our resources on killing aging, or at least stopping this being a disease, and one could certainly consider it a disease, and presumably if we manage to crack aging and you don't have to die involuntarily from age-related diseases, we might look back on aging as a disease. For every day that we don't do this, we're committing kind of an atrocity, because we're dooming, hundreds of thousands of people every day to death. So that's the argument. I think at least one of the arguments on the moral imperative side. But if I, to put my oar in here and give a stupid personal take, I for sure I used to go along with that. It seemed like a very compelling argument. But I think it's even more compelling than just aging. I feel like that's a compelling argument for children dying below the poverty line and children dying of diseases that we could. I'm not. This isn't a bleeding heart rant, but I just mean there's so much we could do with vaccination, with starvation and poverty, whatever else, and waterborne diseases and whatever else. I feel like that's an argument bigger than that. Moral imperative goes so much bigger than people living forever or not dying of aging, if you know what I mean. That, like, for every day we don't try and cure whatever disease it is, aren't we also dooming? I mean, to be honest, I'm sat here having a highfalutin Skype conversation with you. I'm not doing anything about this either much, but just mean you could use that argument from both sides is all I'm saying.
Yeah, no, that leads quite well onto this quote I've got here from Alan Shaw, and I think it was a quote that was made in response to the fable of the dragon tyrant from Nick Bostrom. And he says, life expectancy in 8 countries of southern Africa is less than 40 years, and we must take a little of the responsibility for that. Will we not increase injustice in the world if we succeeded in prolonging our lives into the 2nd century before seeing their lot improved? And I think that's a perfectly valid criticism. Of course, it's good to have such a noble goal as to eradicate aging and to eradicate death. I think that's one thing that Nick Bostrom wants to... they're effectively the same thing. Yes, of course, it's a good thing to have such a noble goal and to aim so high. But I think it would be a mistake if we didn't start at the ground level and at least get everyone up to the same level, at least the same level as we can enjoy now, sitting here debating these issues about children dying in Africa, sitting quite comfortably in our houses and everything. So I think it's the moral question of whether we should is probably a bit further into the future than the moral question of what are we going to do about the stuff that's so wrong about this world right now.
I was reading just today, this isn't in any way a dig specifically at America, it's just whatever the article I was reading just used America as an example, that I think 10% of Americans, or 9 or 10%, I think, are technically living in poverty or about on the poverty line as in the American economy anyway. And I was like, Jesus Christ. I'm sure the statistics are bad all across the world, but it just blew me away that I was sat around having a think about what you and I are going to talk about in terms of building the technological godhead and, putting soft hardware in our brains or whatever. But that really hit home. I just thought, in a very developed economy, and I'm sure it's the same in the UK as well. But yeah, I suppose what's the base version of that is, we should get our shit together first and make sure everyone's at least on an even playing field and being fed, isn't going hungry, isn't dying unnecessarily of diseases that are very easily cured. The other, I suppose, I wouldn't say this, but I guess the cynical response to that, not the cynical, I don't know what the charitable name of it would be, but I've had this idea sometimes. I've seen the same argument leveled against, things I personally really care about, like going to Mars or building building a super collider, building an even larger version of the Large Hadron Collider, extending it. And you will often hear this argument that, hang on, we could be using taxpayers' money for, far more humanitarian. I just mean you could always use that argument for anything, especially for high and noble scientific pursuits. What's the joke about if Columbus had, not that Columbus quite achieved the things that he's necessarily sold on the back of, but still, that if Columbus had listened to that, then we wouldn't have modern America or whatever else, blah blah blah. I don't know, but certainly getting everyone in the world at least to a decent, comfortable standard of living, if that's economically viable, and if we can find the compassion and the technological know-how to do it, that would certainly be very noble. Yeah indeed.
I suppose it depends on how optimistic or pessimistic you want to look at human nature, really. But I like to think that these massive moral questions that we have to ask ourselves, at least they are being asked, and I would hope that we give them due consideration and arrive at, well, what I would call the objectively correct conclusion before we go on and start improving ourselves.
That's that's such a good phrase, the objectively correct conclusion. I might start claiming to have that in arguments from now on. That would be, no, you don't understand. I'm lucky enough to have the objectively correct conclusion here. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, I mean, just to focus on something perhaps slightly less depressing, I would say that there's a reasonable chance that we do manage to arrive at some semblance of everyone having the same level, to level the playing field and allow everyone on Earth to have the same opportunities at the very base level. But once we get to that point, I think then is the time that we can start seeing all these really interesting advancements in technology, and it's from then and only then that we can start to consider ourselves in any case being transhuman. Because I don't know, I wouldn't be comfortable, and I would hope no one would be comfortable in calling themselves transhuman when there are still people that are, so far below them that they don't even have the chances that you do. Yeah, quite right.
Quite right, though. I guess, again, I suppose it is a modern problem in the sense of, you and I, both got to have university educations and do whatever. I was just handed all this stuff in my lap, essentially, by virtue of the geographic lottery. And again, I don't mean as a bleeding heart rant, but not just transhumanism. It's something I think about a lot, that I, just basically in the right place at the right time and fell out of the right genitals in the right place, and it's maybe it's a problem for today as well, trying to level this. But yeah, I don't know if we wait until we're living in a Star Trek future where we're all on a level playing field before we start reaching for these things or not. I don't know. Morally with this one. Yeah, indeed. No, actually, I'll cut the moral rant there, I think. But except for my friend said something that I've been thinking about for a few years. I think he said it as just a throwaway comment, but it really hit home with me. We were talking about, if we were living in this Star Trek future, what would it actually look like, and how would that even work economically, and blah blah blah. And he said, we already have the tools to build heaven, right? We already have the tools to build paradise. Like, they're already to hand. And I thought, Christ, you're probably right. Like, the reason why the world is in, why there is such a gap in earnings and living standards and whatever else, without going down the economic route there. It's not a technological problem at this point. You know, we already have space stations and whatever else. You know, we're doing okay. It's a political problem in a sense. The same way as, you know, we were talking about earlier that there's a reason why we could all be using e-readers. We could all switch to just the digital equivalent of paper and do everything on a screen, but we don't for political and preference reasons. So, technology may not be the only metric here. Is all I mean.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was going to say, was that it does come down to a problem of politics. I mean, I read a statistic the other day. I don't know how true this is, so take it with a grain of salt. But I think it was something like the money we would need to either come up with the vaccines for this pandemic or to protect ourselves against the next pandemic. God forbid there is no next pandemic, but hypothetically, I think it was something like 3% of the Americans' annual military budget.
Wow.
Something absolutely crazy like that. And, you know, it's the same thing like you were talking about with Mars missions, even NASA's new missions to go to the moon. Yes, they cost millions and millions of dollars. But stuff like military budgets and other things which we might not consider so necessary, the size and scale of these things and the interests that people have, it's definitely a political problem that we all need to confront before we can move past it.
I would say on the optimistic side, we're certainly giving it a good go. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands, millions of humans out there who are giving this, and not to include myself in their ranks, but I just mean NGOs, charities, startups, whatever else, people who really are taking this seriously, which is, I mean, that is the nice side of the coin, at least, that we really aren't ignoring this one. We really are trying to get ourselves to a place where everyone gets to live with dignity, food, and hopefully access to decent medical care or whatever else. I try to remind myself of that whenever I'm getting a bit low about this, is all I mean. But
yeah, I mean, you can always kind of descend into these stories of that make you really depressed about the current political sphere of the world, and perhaps we're not doing the best we can, but we're doing well, and I think that goes some way to comfort ourselves.
Well, yeah, and also I can't help commenting that we went at least over an hour without mentioning COVID-19, which is, I think that's pretty good. I was expecting that to come up way earlier from one of us, which is quite impressive. But yeah,
now that you mention it, that's quite impressive.
Well, we should pat ourselves on the back for that. I think that's a good day officially.
Yeah, so I think we've been quite thorough on the actual technology that we might utilize in a transhuman society. We've gone a bit into the ethics. And I think we've arrived at the conclusion that it's we have to acknowledge that there are problems in the current world and there are problems that need fixing and addressing. But nonetheless, these questions about transhumanism and what things might look like in the future are things that we need to start considering now so that we're prepared for when they happen, if indeed they are going to be an eventuality. So I guess I'll ask you the question, if we look forward to the future of society, what would this transhuman society look like? What possible things could there be?
Yeah, well, the wonderful part is that we I suppose we can't, it's beyond imagining almost, which is by virtue of having a silly monkey brain at the moment, and I'm sure for the rest of my life. Though I always think of have you seen these, they're in the whatever the equivalent of sort of, I don't know, Cosmopolitan or Time magazine or whatever at the time was for Victorians. There were lots of fairly famous prints of what they thought the year 2000 would look like, and what the next millennium would look like. Have you come across these? Like with people with it's all very steampunk, very mechanical.
Like sort of this retrofuturism idea.
Yeah, and there was lots of that in the 40s and 50s as well, I think, and it's just amazing how, I don't mean this in a disrespectful way towards them, but it's just amazing how wrong they got it, because like the Arthur C. Clarke quote, "Nothing ages faster than the future." I think it was Arthur Clarke who said that. And if there's one thing we didn't see coming that we're living in now, almost no one saw I think they thought there was going to be a robotics revolution, right? But what we actually got was a communications revolution, and it just goes to show that the future's imagination, or the imagination of future generations and the capriciousness of technology is just off the scale. We can't even imagine what's coming. So yeah, I can guarantee whatever's coming, it probably doesn't look like any of our depictions of the future today, though it's probably still going to involve computation, and it's probably still going to involve modification. But beyond that, I don't know. How about you? If you had to make a prediction about the next 500 years, say?
Oh, I don't know. It's a difficult question.
Yeah,
like you
no,
said,
no
it's
pressure,
beyond our imagining.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you talk about the Victorians and their predictions and speculations about what the future will be like and how wrong they were. I mean, you look even 10, 20 years ago at the Back to the Future films, what they thought the future was going to be like.
Yeah.
Even at something like Blade Runner.
That was set, wasn't that set now?
I think Blade Runner was set in November last year,
Okay, wow.
if memory serves me correctly.
Wow, was it?
Yeah, so there's obviously these films are works of science fiction and they can afford some liberties, but look at how wrong they were about even things in such a small time frame.
Well, and so not to interrupt, but just what I'm thinking about. Do you know there's a movie? I was watching a movie, Event Horizon, the other day, like terrifying sci-fi movie, and it's set, I don't know, fairly far ahead this century, and there's a faster than light starship that they're walking around on. But I mean, it's laughable now. It wasn't then, but there are memory banks where they're using CDs, right? I was like, wait, what? Hang on.
Yeah,
you can go faster than light, but anyway, sorry. Yeah.
No, that was basically the point I was trying to make, is that even in such a short time frame, I don't know when Blade Runner and Back to the Future was released, but they still didn't have the predictive power that was required in order to even imagine what the state of the world would be like today. And
yeah,
I think one of the potentials of transhumanism is that it's potentially got unlimited scope for improvement and advancement of the human condition. And it's sort of built into that idea that we literally cannot imagine what it's going to be like, because the levels of intelligence they're going to have in that society is so much greater than ours now. So that they might conceivably have completely different ways of even conceptualizing things and thinking about things. We couldn't even begin to imagine what their subjective experience of reality is going to be like.
Yeah. Well, yeah, hey, brave new worlds and brave new bombs. But I think it's I don't think it's even the reason why I mentioned these Victorian prints and just how how kind of quaint they are now is because they didn't seem to have technology blindness. I think if you'd explained the internet to them in a very gentle way, they could probably catch on quite quickly. Hopefully the same way I hope we can if we were talking to someone 100 years ahead with their technology. But they didn't seem to have technology blindness. They had paradigm blindness because they couldn't conceive of the paradigm of the information age. And the same as, to be honest, I don't think my parents could before they had it, So it's almost like technology isn't even the limiting factor in trying to imagine ahead. It's just like you were saying, it's the paradigm of how people, the new technological and new maybe philosophical paradigms of the next 500 years, 1,000 years or whatever. I mean, God knows, economically, politically and technologically, just how we might modify our societies. If blockchain comes to fruition, and currency goes in that direction, if governments let it, if genetic engineering comes to fruition, if governments let it, God knows what. And also, I mean, I think you said this there, as well as the subjective experiences of future humans and future whatever else, future cats, I hope, it's also the future interests and future preferences for what they might want to build and what they might want to do. Like, traveling to other planets might seem as laughably quaint as alchemy seems to us, looking back to the alchemists fooling around with lead or whatever. So I mean, we can't even. Yeah, that's all I meant. It's almost paradigm blindness that we have sitting here in 2020 rather than technological blindness in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And I just hope to bring it back to a point that we mentioned earlier about how splitting the atom can either lead to nuclear power or nuclear warfare, I suppose. There's so much potential for greatness but there's likewise, by the same token, there's almost unlimited potential for destruction as well.
Yeah. Oh, and this could easily be the last century of our species. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I hope and I have faith that we choose the right option, and that we've thought out all our options very, very carefully, which is why this is an important discussion to have now.
Yeah. Well, and we're quite lucky in that, we're not unique in this. This is a conversation that's going on, to be honest, in popular culture now, which wasn't that. I mean, futurism did exist. It has always existed, at least through lots of the last century. People were always pontificating about the future, but like you see lots of conversations now about, but like TED Talks and whatever else, about how even AI is potentially a world-killing technology. And with regards to what you just said, I'm so glad that we're actually having these conversations, that we're not walking blind into technological alleys where we can do ourselves in,
Yeah, precisely. It's massively important that we have these conversations now, which is, well, one of the reasons that I'm so glad we had this conversation on the podcast, just to, in our own little minor way, just to add to the discussion that's going on.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Well, a pleasure as always. Yeah, indeed, man.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a brilliant place in which to end our conversation.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you once again for coming on. I really enjoyed this one.
Well, no, and thank you, same as last time, and the other last time that we didn't put out for certain reasons. But yeah, no, thank you for yeah. Sorry about that, but thank you for playing consummate host, man. It's an absolute pleasure to talk with you.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine. No worries.
Can I interrogate you about anything you're working on that you wanna reveal?
Well, I don't want to reveal too much at this stage, but definitely watch for the 1 year anniversary of the Mystiverse channel. There will be some big things coming.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Oh, most exciting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll watch this space for sure.
Likewise, your book as well. Can we ask any questions about this yet?
I think you were kind enough to ask me about this last time, and that was months ago. And I think I said about another month, and it's been quite a lot more than another month. I just really don't want to fuck it up. So I was hoping to get it out for the end of December, and I don't know how realistic that is, but December, January, I will commit to one of those. Certainly, I have it as a physical thing on my desk, this wad of paper. So it is a thing, but it's just not a very good thing at the moment. So, and I would like it to be at least a halfway good thing. So, yeah, that's
well, I'm sure it's going to be fantastic, and I wish you all the best with it.
Thanks a lot. Well, thank you, man.
Well, thank you very much for coming on, and I guess I'll see you until next time.
All right. Okay, man.
See you. Bye.